There are hidden black communities in America where the average household income quietly crosses seven figures, where billion-dollar deals are discussed over backyard barbecues, and where most Americans have no idea these places even exist. But here's the real question. How deep does hidden black wealth in America actually go? And what happens when you peel back the layers and reach the highest level? Let's count it down to find out. Level 1. Visible success, cultural comfort. This is the level most people recognize when they picture black wealth. Not because it's loud or flashy, but because it's familiar and perfectly fits the mainstream image. These are the neighborhoods where success feels earned, deserved, and openly enjoyed. You see nice cars in the driveway, well-kept lawns, kids heading to good schools, and households where college wasn't a dream. It was the plan from day one. In short, this is visible success, and there's nothing accidental about it. Well, honestly, it's not even the surface of what the actual black wealth in America looks like, but we'll talk about that in later levels. For now, let's explore what transpires at this level. The people here are your doctors, attorneys, dentists, senior managers, and corporate climbers who played the long game. Dual-income households are common, not because anyone is struggling, but because ambition tends to marry ambition. Add in a few entrepreneurs who exited a business for seven figures or landed a lucrative equity deal, and you're looking at net worths that usually sit somewhere between $2 and $15 million. Comfortable money, solid money, life is good money. Geographically, this level shows up in very specific places. Communities that reside in South Fulton and parts of Cobb County outside Atlanta. Then there's Mitchellville in Maryland, which is one of the most affluent black communities in the U.S., with a median household income around $118,000 and high education levels. Another Maryland community that fits Level 1 perfectly is Fort Washington, an upper-middle-class suburb near Washington with a median income above $110,000. And let's not forget Glendale in Prince George's County, Missouri City outside Houston, and DeSoto, Texas. These aren't random pins on a map. They're communities that formed because black professionals wanted proximity to opportunity without sacrificing culture. Places where you don't have to explain yourself at the PTA meeting or feel like the exception on your own street. The wealth mechanics here are straightforward. High W-2 income, professional practices, maybe a few rental properties on the side. The primary home is the anchor, both financially and emotionally. Money gets spent on good schools, travel, and lifestyle upgrades that make life smoother, not necessarily louder. And yes, there's some flex, luxury cars, family vacations, the occasional social media post, but it's never the whole point. And here's the thing most people get wrong. They assume this is the ceiling. That if you've made it here, you've made it. In reality, though, this is just the most visible layer of black wealth. It's the wealth you're allowed to see. And once you understand that, the next level starts to make a lot more sense. Because the families in Level 2 haven't disappeared. They are a little less interested in what we can call performance. And that's where visibility begins to drop. On purpose. Level 2. Quiet professional money. Level 2 feels similar at first glance, but the difference shows up in the details. This is where the flex fades, the noise drops, and the planning gets serious. You won't see much online presence here. And if you do, it's carefully curated. These are families who already proved what they needed to prove. Now they're just optimizing, striving to reach higher levels. The people at this level tend to be specialists rather than generalists. Orthopedic surgeons instead of family doctors. Anesthesiologists instead of ER physicians. Senior executives with equity packages instead of just titles. Franchise owners who don't own one location but several. Their net worth usually sits between $10 and $40 million. And importantly, it doesn't all show up as income. A lot of it lives quietly inside businesses, trusts, and long-term structures. Geographically, these families tend to choose places that feel intentional rather than impressive. Friendly and Bowie, Maryland are perfect examples. In Friendly, median household incomes push past $120,000, with high home ownership and neighborhoods that feel planned for longevity, not applause. Bowie leans even higher, often clearing $140,000, and while it's more diverse, it attracts Black professionals who want structure, stability, and schools that work without the noise. You see the same logic playing out around Atlanta's outer suburbs, in places like Marietta and Duluth. They aren't majority Black enclaves, but they've quietly drawn affluent Black households who prioritize access to jobs, strong school districts, and a lower-profile lifestyle. The wealth here blends in on purpose. No one's performing success. Then, there are select suburbs around Raleigh-Durham, where privacy and zoning matter more than being close to the cultural center. These areas attract specialists and senior executives who could live louder but don't see the upside. This level of wealth isn't about visibility anymore. It's about efficiency, predictability, and choosing environments that reduce friction instead of adding to it. What really separates this level is how money behaves. Business income begins to outweigh salary. Homes get bigger, but also more understated. You'll notice fewer flashy renovations and more intentional design choices. Kids attend private schools or elite magnet programs, not for status, but for insulation and opportunity. Wealth starts flowing through LLCs and family trusts, not personal accounts. And conversations shift from "what do you do" to "how long do you plan to hold that asset?" And here's a subtle but important shift. Status at this level stops being the goal altogether. Time becomes the real currency, and so does peace. These families aren't trying to be admired. They're trying to be left alone. They want safety, efficiency, and access, without spectacle. And honestly, once you notice it, the contrast with Level 1 is obvious. Less social media, less visible consumption, way more financial structuring behind the scenes. And when money stops being about lifestyle altogether and starts becoming about leverage, that's when things get really interesting, because that's what Level 3 is all about. Level 3. Business Class Black Wealth. This is the level where Black wealth stops feeling like an individual achievement and starts behaving like infrastructure. You can sense the difference almost immediately, even if you can't always name it. The houses might not be dramatically bigger than Level 2, and the cars might actually be less flashy, but everything underneath the surface is heavier. More moving parts, more people employed, more responsibility attached to every decision. The families here are rarely tied to just one income stream. You're looking at multi-unit franchise owners who don't work the register anymore, logistics operators whose trucks run whether they're awake or not, construction and healthcare business owners who manage payrolls larger than some small towns. A lot of these businesses are entering their second generation, which changes the mindset completely. This isn't "how much can I make this year?" This is "how long can this thing last?" Net worths usually land somewhere between 30 and 100 million, but the number itself almost feels secondary to the structure behind it. Geographically, this level of wealth clusters where ownership actually works. Southwest Atlanta, especially areas like Midwest Cascade, is a prime example. A predominantly Black affluent pocket where rising home values sit alongside franchise owners, construction operators, and healthcare businesses quietly moving serious payroll through the zip code. This isn't flash money, it's operational money. You see similar patterns in legacy Black corridors of Prince George's County, where ownership never really left, It just got more sophisticated. Nationally, census tracts in places like South Orange, New Jersey, and Cambria Heights, New York, show majority Black households clearing 100,000 plus incomes, often tied to multi-unit businesses and professional practices rather than single salaries. Then there's Fort Bend County outside Houston, parts of Charlotte and the Triangle, and inland California hubs near ports and freight routes, where logistics and construction quietly outperform trendier plays. These families don't chase vibes. They position themselves where control, contracts, and scale intersect. What defines this level is how wealth is deployed. Commercial real estate becomes the backbone. Warehouses, medical offices, strip centers, industrial parks. Payroll-heavy businesses dominate because they create leverage. These families understand that employing hundreds of people isn't just a responsibility, it's insulation. Reinvestment beats consumption every time. Homes are nice, but they're secondary. Assets come first. A property that produces income is always more exciting than one that just looks good in photos. Here's the shift that usually catches people off guard. Wealth stops being about what you earn and starts being about what you control. Control over contracts, control over supply chains, control over land and timing. And once you've experienced that level of control, it's very hard to go back to chasing trends or lifestyle validation. This level exists because Black families finally cracked access to capital, contracts, and institutional relationships that were historically locked away. It took decades of persistence, relationship building, and sometimes sheer stubbornness. But once the door opened, the ones who walked through it didn't just grab checks. They built systems. And when systems start passing from parent to child, something else changes too. The appetite for visibility drops fast, because once control becomes generational, privacy isn't a preference anymore, it's a requirement. Level 4, hidden enclaves and legacy corridors. Level 4 is where things get genuinely hard to spot. These aren't the places that show up on richest neighborhoods lists or luxury real estate Instagram accounts. You won't stumble into them while house hunting. And that's not an accident. The families here don't need attention, and frankly, they don't want it either. Their wealth already did what it needed to do a long time ago. The people living at this level are families with decades of accumulated wealth. Owners of regional empires you've definitely interacted with, even if you've never heard their names. Principals of family offices whose job isn't to make money, but to keep it organized, protected, and growing across generations. Net worths usually range from $75 million to $250 million, but again, the number isn't the flex. Longevity is. You find these enclaves in places with history baked into the soil. Historic Black land holdings in Georgia and the Carolinas that were acquired when nobody else wanted them and held through every economic cycle imaginable. Estates in Prince George's County quietly passed down generational real estate without fanfare. Ranch-style properties in Texas, where acreage matters more than address prestige. Gated communities that aren't flashy, but culturally private, meaning everyone knows everyone, and outsiders stand out immediately. The wealth mechanics here are slow and deliberate. Land appreciation over generations does the heavy lifting. Property is often held in trusts, not individual names. Family governance systems exist, sometimes formal, sometimes informal, but always intentional. Meetings happen, rules exist, decisions aren't emotional. Philanthropy plays a role, but not the Instagram kind. It's influence-based, strategic, and often quiet, aimed at shaping outcomes rather than headlines. What stands out most is how little these families move. They don't chase hot markets. They don't follow trends. They stay put while the world bends around them. Highways get built closer. Cities expand outward. Values rise. And because they already owned the land, They benefit without ever making a public move. This is where wealth becomes invisible by design. Not hidden out of fear, but out of confidence. When you know your position is secure, there's no need to broadcast it. And above this level, things get even more selective. Because once wealth reaches this scale, it's not just about privacy anymore. It's about controlling proximity itself. Level 5. Institutional Black Wealth. Level 5 is the point where wealth no longer interacts with everyday life the way most of us understand it. These families aren't selling products to consumers or chasing market trends. They're dealing with governments, banks, and entire cities. Their wealth doesn't just sit inside buildings, it determines where those buildings go in the first place. The people at this level are developers who don't just build projects, but reshape corridors. Infrastructure owners whose assets quietly support millions of daily interactions. Financial backers whose signatures unlock deals that would otherwise stall for years. Political donors who understand that influence is less about ideology and more about access. Net worths here typically sit between 200 million and $500 million, though many hover above that line in ways that don't show up cleanly on paper. You'll find them scattered in very specific places. Atlanta's power corridors, not the flashy parts, but the areas near zoning boards, transit authorities, and redevelopment zones. DC-adjacent estates, where proximity to policy matters more than square footage. Houston's inner loop commercial hubs, where land, energy, and logistics intersect. Southern logistics centers near ports, rail, and interstates, where owning the right parcel of land at the right time can quietly generate 9 figures. The wealth mechanics here are entirely different from earlier levels. Public-private partnerships are the engine. Zoning influence becomes a form of leverage. Long-term municipal contracts replace short-term profits. These families don't ask what a property is worth today. They ask what the city plans to do around it over the next 20 years. And then they position themselves accordingly. What's fascinating, and honestly a little intimidating, is how calm everything feels at this level. There's no rush, no urgency. Deals take years to mature, and that's by design. When you're shaping environments instead of reacting to them, patience becomes your sharpest tool. This level exists because some Black families figured out how to sit at tables that historically excluded them, and then stayed long enough to become fixtures rather than guests. Once you're embedded in those systems, your wealth doesn't fluctuate with trends. It compounds with policy. But here's the quiet truth most people miss. Once wealth reaches this scale, exposure becomes a liability. And that's when physical separation begins to matter. Level 6. Ultra-private Black Wealth Zones. Level 6 is where Black wealth quietly steps out of the public conversation altogether. Not because it disappeared, but because visibility stopped serving a purpose. At this level, you're dealing with centimillionaires, quiet billionaires, and heirs whose names are deliberately absent from Google searches. These aren't people who want to be admired. They want to be undisturbed. What separates this tier from Level 5 isn't just money, it's mindset. In Level 5, wealth still interacts with systems, city councils, banks, public-private partnerships. In Level 6, wealth begins insulating itself from those systems. These families already know how power works. Now they're focused on preserving optionality, safety, and control across decades, not headlines. Geographically, this wealth drifts away from recognizable prestige. Not Beverly Hills, not Buckhead, not the places people name-drop. Instead, it settles into gated estates far from cultural centers, ranch-style properties where land itself creates distance, and island-adjacent homes that offer water as a natural moat without the exposure of being on an island. The locations often feel boring on paper, until you realize that boredom is part of the design. Security becomes an invisible infrastructure rather than a visible flex. You won't see guards standing around. You'll see controlled access roads, private agreements with local law enforcement, redundant systems layered so smoothly they disappear into the background. It's the kind of setup where nothing ever happens, because everything already has. The wealth mechanics here shift almost entirely toward preservation. International diversification isn't about chasing opportunity. It's about hedging instability. Trusts, layered LLCs, and long-term asset protection structures become conversational shorthand. Decisions are filtered through questions like, will this expose us? Will this complicate succession? Will this draw attention we don't need? What strikes me most about this level is how uninterested these families are in cultural validation. There's no need to prove success, no desire to represent. Many of them already did that work in earlier generations. Now the priority is making sure grandchildren inherit freedom, not expectations. This level exists because extreme wealth attracts friction, legal, social, even psychological. And the most effective response isn't louder success, it's quieter living. But even this retreat has limits, because there's one final tier where wealth doesn't just withdraw from society, it stops needing it altogether. Level 7, Sovereign Black Wealth, where wealth becomes its own ecosystem. Level 7 doesn't feel like the top of a ladder. It feels like stepping off the ladder entirely. This is sovereign black wealth. Money so large, so diversified, and so systemically embedded that it no longer relies on public infrastructure, public approval, or public awareness to function. These are multi-billionaire families whose influence operates without needing to announce itself. At this level, geography stops being about location and starts being about jurisdiction. Private islands aren't aesthetic choices, they're governance decisions. Ultra-exclusive compounds aren't about luxury, they're about autonomy. These places don't show up on richest neighborhoods lists because they don't participate in the same real estate logic. You can't stumble into them, you can't tour them, and in many cases, you can't even verify who owns what without insider access. In short, we shift from community-level wealth to individual grandeur, just like Tyler Perry's billion-dollar mansions in Atlanta, Oprah Winfrey's properties, and Beyoncé and Jay-Z's private islands in the Bahamas. The mechanics of wealth here basically resemble those of small states owned by a very select group of people. Assets aren't just diversified, they're compartmentalized. Energy holdings, logistics networks, data infrastructure, land across multiple continents. Private security that rivals municipal forces. Legal teams that operate internationally. Wealth is no longer measured cleanly in net worth because net worth doesn't capture control. What's fascinating is how little day-to-day lifestyle matters at this level. These families and individuals aren't chasing experiences. They're managing systems. Decisions revolve around resilience, how assets survive political shifts, how governance structures outlast individuals, how power transfers without disruption. Succession planning here looks less like inheritance and more like statecraft. And despite the scale, the visibility is near zero. These people are not interested in interviews or podcasts, and certainly not in branding exercises. Their influence shows up indirectly, in policy outcomes, in market movements, and in which projects quietly get greenlit while others stall. And if you think it's celebrity-level wealth, it's not that. It's infrastructural power embedded in ambition and materialism. This level exists because at a certain scale, participation becomes inefficient. Systems designed for millions don't serve those operating in billions. So the wealth adapts by building parallel frameworks, quieter, larger, and far more insulated. And that's why most people never even see these levels. Not because they're hidden poorly, but because they were never meant to be seen at all. And so, these were the 7 levels of hidden black wealth across America. Which level did you find the most interesting one? Let us know in the comments, and for more such riveting videos about black luxury, take a look at the channel.